Just say a big welcome, everybody, while we're waiting for people to come in. We'll just be starting in just a minute. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I'm just going to give it just 30 more seconds and then we'll get going because we've got a lot to get through this afternoon. Okay, let's start this. So good afternoon, everyone, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to the last of this webinar series focusing on racism and homelessness. My name is Sarah Walters and I head up the Impacts Research and Practice team at Crisis. So we already had two standalone webinars following some research that was published on racism and homelessness in October. First looked at the personal impacts of race and homelessness, and we then looked at how services operate within the housing system and what needs to change. And today we're looking at identifying and addressing inequalities in systems. The other two webinars, if you're interested, can be still viewed on Crisis's YouTube channel if you missed them. And I think the link to both of those was included in your invitation today. So I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping. So be aware that we're recording this video before it gets uploaded to YouTube. So if you want to be on camera, that's absolutely fine with us, or if you prefer to be off, it's up to you, your choice, but be aware of that. We're going to use certain terminology in discussion which might differ from what you're expecting, so I guess be aware of this, and also that we're looking at the big picture stuff today. And there might also be within that some personal stories and themes which could be upsetting, so just, I guess, be aware of that too, and please take care of yourself. So you're all muted. And if you could use the chat for Q&A, as we go through, questions might appear to you or so present themselves to you. So please feel free to put those in the chat as and when that happens. But if you could indicate if the question is for a particular speaker, that would help us in deciding who to direct the questions to. So we've a fascinating and insightful 90 minutes ahead of us with some really expert analysis and consideration of a topic which feels really timely. Racial inequality has a profound impact on individuals and us as a society, and we need considered and expert insight to inform the public debate, and I know that we'll get that today. So I'd like to introduce Professor Suzanne Fitzpatrick to come and speak first. Suzanne is the director of iSphere. She's one of the leading international scholars on homelessness and has undertaken research on family, single and youth homelessness, as well as on rough sleeping, street culture activities, domestic violence and rights-based approaches to tackling housing exclusion. Suzanne's major research programmes include the Crisis-funded Homelessness Monitor Series, Destitution in the UK for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, State of the Nation Research on Homelessness and Racial Inequalities for the Oak Foundation, to which she's speaking today, as well as international evaluation of approaches to reducing street homelessness with the Institute of Global Homelessness, and much more. So I'll pass over to you, Suzanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and it's great to be here today and to see that we've got a fantastically large and diverse audience for this important topic. As Sarah has said, I'm speaking today about research that myself and colleagues in iSphere at Heriot-Watt University have undertaken on homelessness and minoritised ethnic groups in the UK. This is an Oak Foundation funded research programme. It's a fairly substantial research programme over a 3-year period. And we've worked with a range of partners in both the homelessness and the race equalities world on this work, including specifically the Runnymede Trust and Rota Race on the Agenda for particular aspects of the work. The aims of this programme were to offer an authoritative account of the overall statistical picture on homelessness among Black and minoritized communities in the UK, to generate qualitative evidence that offers a deep dive into particular groups, issues and experiences of concern. But also, crucially, the programme has a capacity building element to it, including via research internships. We had 3 paid research internships as part of the programme, and you'll be hearing a little bit about what those interns found in their particular topics, and also a range of networking activities, of which this seminar programme is one. We have published a number of reports already as part of this programme, because it is a substantial programme with a wide range of methods and topics covered. So we've sort of published as we've gone along, although there is also a forthcoming final report that will draw all of this together. So our first output in the programme was a State of the Nation report that we published back in November 22, which provided a statistical overview of homelessness among minoritised communities in the UK. And as with most of this programme, although it is UK-wide, the majority of the work has focused on England, obviously as the largest of the 4 UK countries, but also where the most minoritised people live. So that was the first output of the study, of the programme. The second was one of our interns published his report in August 23 on homelessness among Roma people. That was in Glasgow and in Luton. He did a comparison of the two. Our next publication was on conceptualisations and definitions of homelessness among different minoritised communities, and that was conducted in partnership with the Runnymede Trust. Published back in April 24, and another intern report focused on young Black people's experiences of homelessness in London. We have 3 more reports which are not yet published but will be very shortly. One on race, ethnicity and multiple disadvantage by another intern. A very substantial report on deep dive that we conducted with the help of the West Midlands Combined Authority on designing out homelessness amongst minoritised communities in that region. And as I've mentioned, we have a final report which we're currently pulling together, finessing, and that incorporates the key findings, the highlights from all of these elements of the programme, but also updated statistical analysis and a lived experience deep dive, where we've done a series of focus groups with people with lived experience of homelessness, most of them based in London, but some elsewhere. So today what I plan to do is draw out the kind of main findings, the headlines from across this broad programme of work, particularly those which speak to the systems level analysis and systems level inequalities is the focus of this webinar. I'll be talking first of all about the disproportionate experience of homelessness among minoritised communities and the drivers of that disproportionality, including discrimination, and then talking about the key systems, particularly the statutory homelessness system and the asylum system, but also other public bodies and services that act to either mitigate or exacerbate those systemic inequalities. And I'll also be touching on our recommendations, which are still somewhat in draft form, but to give you a flavour of where we're going with that and hopefully get some feedback on them as well. So just to say that in my presentation today, we will be then drawing on evidence which has already been published, but also some unpublished evidence which is still being finessed prior to us publishing the final report. So moving on to the first of the substantive slides. In the State of the Nation report in 22, we presented overwhelming evidence of the disproportionate rate of homelessness amongst minoritized communities, especially Black people. And our new and updated analysis of HCLIC data, which is the official homelessness statistical data in England, confirms this picture. As you can see in this graph, Black communities, which are in the sort of brown colour, and also people of other ethnicities, many of whom are from the Middle East or North Africa, experience very large excess risks of statutory homelessness, with Black people almost 4 times as likely to face statutory homelessness as white people, and other groups 3 times as likely. So these are very disproportionate patterns, and as you can see, they pertain across all of the broad regions of England. Moving on to the next slide. However, the statutory homelessness system does by no means captures everybody who's homeless in the UK, and that's particularly true in England, where single homeless people are not entitled to be rehoused, and therefore many of them do not come forward and apply to local authorities. And there are a whole range of more hidden homeless situations which minoritized groups are also at higher risk of, such as sofa surfing. And we provided evidence of that in the first State of the Nation report and will in our final report as well. But for today, I just wanted to pick up on another form of hidden homelessness, or at least potential hidden homelessness, and that's overcrowding, where there are really very substantial, in fact, pretty dramatic ethnic disparities, as you can see from this this chart, which is based on English Housing Survey. So you can see that it's the Pakistani Bangladeshi group in this case are at greatest risk of overcrowding. 15% of those households are overcrowded, but also Black households, almost 13% of Black households are overcrowded as well. And the risk ratios here are huge. So Pakistani Bangladeshi households are 7 times more likely than white households to be overcrowded, and Black households are 6 times more likely than white households to be overcrowded. So you've really got some enormous disparities across both more visible forms of homelessness, like statutory homelessness, but also overcrowding. So moving on to the next slide. In the State of the Nation report, we undertook statistical analysis to try and better understand what was driving these disproportionate rates, and we applied logistic regression techniques, which enable you to test whether, when you hold a whole set of relevant factors constant, whether there is still an independent effect of ethnicity in increasing risks of homelessness. And we found, yes, there is. So this graph is based on data from the English Housing Survey as well. And as you can see, Black people, a much higher proportion of Black people have experienced homelessness, according to the measure in that survey, than other groups, particularly as compared with white people. So it's about 16% of Black households versus 5% of white-led households say that they have ever experienced homelessness. The vertical axis represents the percentage of households experiencing homelessness in each of these broad ethnic categories, broken down into the parts that can be attributed statistically to particular groups of explanatory factors. So what this shows is that the higher incidence of homelessness for Black and mixed other groups can be attributed to a range of factors, including demographic factors like age and household type, and also employment factors. But far more significant are the housing factors, which are coloured in purple in this chart, and that's including things like renting rather than owning your home. This plays a very significant role in increasing risks of homelessness for all groups, but particularly for Black groups. But the other really very important point that this chart makes is that even when you hold all of those other factors constant, so when you control for levels of poverty and tenure distribution and household type and so on, there is still an independent effect of ethnicity on increasing homelessness rates, particularly again for Black people. So there's something else going on here beyond these other factors. There's an independent effect of ethnicity. Moving on to the next slide. But what it's also important to understand is that the previous figure captures only the direct effect of ethnicity and homelessness after you control for all the other factors. But what we also found in the State of the Nation analysis is that ethnicity-related factors affect homelessness risks indirectly as well as directly by, for example, heightening the levels of poverty or the chances of being a renter rather than an owner, which in turn then increase exposure to homelessness. So it's important to take account of these indirect effects of ethnicity as well as the direct effects in understanding the overall disproportionate risks that Black and other minoritized groups face. What this table captures is statistical modelling of the relative chances of ethnic minority households with certain characteristics experiencing homelessness as compared with white households with the same or very similar characteristics. And as you can see from the risk ratio in the first of those columns, all of these vignettes of Black and minoritized ethnic households experience markedly higher rates of homelessness than their white equivalents. But also what this captures is that these indirect effects contribute very substantially to these excess risks. So to take as an example, the first of those rows, if you take a Black household, a Black-led household reporting discrimination with characteristics which are otherwise average for the UK population, they are nearly 50% more likely to experience homelessness than a comparable white household, with 2/3 of that effect being indirect via poverty and housing conditions. And as you can see, there are more extreme examples in this table. For example, young Black people in London are some 530% more likely to experience homelessness than a similar young white person, with 3/4 of that effect being via these indirect effects. So you're seeing some very, very disproportionate experience of homelessness, with ethnicity playing both direct and indirect effects in driving up those risks. Moving on to the next slide. I think the important point to get across about these indirect effects of ethnicity is that they provide strong evidence that embedded and widespread structural disadvantage rooted in historic racism is a crucial factor in explaining present-day statistical patterns in terms of homelessness. But we've also discovered as part of our work evidence of contemporary forms of discrimination which may well be playing a role in accounting for disproportionate levels of homelessness in minoritised communities. So this chart captures data from the English Housing Survey, again, which asked whether people had experienced discrimination from a social or a private landlord. And as you can see, very substantial proportions of Black, but also Asian and other ethnicities reported that they had, and that this was particularly true of Black people experiencing homelessness, captured on the right side of the chart, the sort of brown coloured column. You can see it's about almost a third, 32% of Black people who've experienced homelessness reported having experienced discrimination. And in the qualitative work that we've done, particularly with people with lived experience, but also with frontline workers, racism from private landlords was a very big theme. And a lot of this seemed to centre around the sense of impunity that private landlords have, particularly with refugees and other especially vulnerable migrant groups, that they can act or they can treat people in poor and unlawful ways and are unlikely to be challenged about that, or at least that is their perception. So that was a big theme in the qualitative research as well. Moving on to the next slide. While that last chart focuses on discrimination, racism within the housing world, within the qualitative work that we have done, both with people with lived experience, but also with frontline workers. We encountered a lot of very consistent themes around racist stereotypes that affect service responses well beyond the housing and homelessness sectors, affecting criminal justice, education, health, social security, and social services. But there were a few key threads that ran through what people reported with their experiences of those different kinds of services. And these quotes try and capture some of those key themes. So, for example, one key theme revolved around the stereotype that Black people are somehow intrinsically untrustworthy, and Black women in particular were often said to be treated more suspiciously than white women. You know, so that first quote there talks about whether they're believed when they talk to the police about experience of abuse, and similarly with healthcare services and so on. Black women fleeing domestic violence were said to be assumed to be less vulnerable than white women in similar circumstances, and with racist stereotypes of the angry Black woman and the dangerous Black man said to affect the reactions of a wide range of services. And there was a real emphasis from the frontline workers in particular that often these were very unconscious bias. They were racialized assumptions about people's levels of needs, their resilience, and how vulnerable they were perceived to be. They weren't necessarily conscious, but they were operating a kind of under the radar, if you like, and for that reason could be very difficult to challenge and to evidence. And local authority officers or senior stakeholders in local authorities we spoke to for that reason were very keen on robust data on ethnic disparities, feeling that we really need this concrete evidence in order to identify, call out and challenge these damaging stereotypes. And the kind of idea of the angry Black woman in particular came across very strongly from a whole range of the lived experience work that we did, as well as the work with the frontline staff across a range of sectors. The idea of somebody's frustrated because they're not getting the service that they need. They are interpreted as being angry rather than as somebody who's is frustrated and requires assistance. So that idea of the impact of unconscious bias is particularly towards Black people came across really quite strongly. Moving on now to talking about the more systemic side of responses, we've done some new analysis using special access arrangements to H-CLIC official homelessness data to look at what the outcomes are for people who apply as statutory homeless in England. As most people on the call probably will know, local authorities in the UK, including in England, have duties towards certain homeless households. In England, those duties are about preventing homelessness, relieving homelessness for those who are already homeless, and also main stage rehousing duties for families with children and other priority need groups. This chart captures the final accommodation outcome achieved by statutorily homeless households by ethnic group, regardless of what stage in that process the local authority ends its duty. So whether it's under prevention, a relief, or a main stage duty. And the really key, well, there's a number of key things to take out of this chart. First of all, that the proportion of people or proportion of families going through the statutory homelessness system who actually achieve access social housing is remarkably small. It's only 20%. And that's very important given that that's the main outcome that most people are seeking when they apply as statutory homeless. But it's a reflection of just how the acute shortage of social housing across many parts of the country. But also for our purposes, what is very striking is the huge ethnic disparity in this. While 24% of white statutory homeless families gain social housing, this is true for only 10 to 12% of most minoritised groups. And while access to private rented sector as a rehousing outcome is more evenly spread, this isn't sufficient to fully level the playing field in terms of rehousing with white families. I'd also like to draw your attention to the top of each of the bars, because that's the proportion of people who leave the statutory system to an unknown destination, which for many will not be positive. And again, this is, as you can see, this is more likely for Black households in particular. In the interest of time, I haven't presented the same data for single people, but as you'd expect, a lower proportion of them get access to social housing because they tend not to be in priority need. But again, very similar ethnic disparities. We've also done analysis that shows that homeless migrant families are less likely to get rehoused than non-migrant families across all ethnicities. So this is pretty powerful data of systemic inequalities. Moving on to the next slide. What we also know is that Black households spend longer in temporary accommodation than other households, including particularly white households. And this is, again, and based on analysis of the official homelessness data. So in other words, not only do Black and other minoritized communities have poorer ultimate outcomes from the statutory homelessness system, they wait longer to achieve them. And this is very important because we know from the research we've done and the research that many others have done about how poor and cramped the physical conditions are in this temporary accommodation. And there's also the sense of life being on hold for people who are spending extended periods, often in not entirely appropriate accommodation, with many of these placements being far out of people's home areas as well, which is something that Nick is going to pick up on in more detail later in the session. Moving on to the next slide. I think that another point that I'd like to sort of highlight from our lived experience work in particular is how badly people felt they had been treated in the statutory homelessness system a lot of the time. I mean, to some extent, or to a large extent, the outcomes around the settled and the temporary accommodation people receive reflect the huge pressures on the system. They explain, if not excuse, those kind of poorer than you would want accommodation outcomes. But there was also something else that people talked about a lot, which is just how they were treated when they approached local authority homelessness services. And this was mostly a London-based sample that we were talking to, but there was a very prominent recurring theme about the rudeness and the lack of empathy that they experienced from homelessness officers. And these quotes capture, or the first two of these quotes capture some of that. And this included, on a number of occasions, racist comments that implied that people should be grateful because it's better than they would get in their own country. Sometimes these were comments made by people from the same ethnicity as the person applying as homeless. And the other theme that came up, and a point I would make here as well, is that what came across to us is these comments about sort of rudeness and lack of empathy were made much more often about statutory homelessness than other public services. So I did feel that there is something going on there that needs to be addressed. Another point that wasn't raised by any of the professionals we interviewed, but by quite a lot of people with lived experience, is the lack of face-to-face services, that very often things are now dealt with over the telephone or online. Rather than people being able to actually go into offices when they apply as homeless. And I think that third quote, particularly the final line, captures the frustration that people could feel within that they call and people don't call back, and they can't get to speak to the same person twice, and so on, and things just don't seem to be resolved. This idea we're just screaming and no one's hearing was a very sort of powerful sentiment that was expressed. Moving on to the next system that I'd like to say something about, which is the impact of the asylum system on homelessness among minoritised communities. We heard a lot about this when we did the deep dive into homelessness in the West Midlands Combined Authority area, about the sort of intensifying pressures arising from the asylum system, and how that was putting pressure on statutory homeless and temporary accommodation system already at breaking point. And this is an issue that extends well beyond the West Midlands. As you can see from this table, the number of people who have been applied as statutory homeless and whose eligibility for assistance is based on either having refugee status or other leave to remain has increased very substantially in England over the last 3 years, in fact by 182%. So this is a growing source of statutory homeless applications, and for families with children, in particular, that leads to main duty, rehousing duties, which local authorities have to honour. And a lot of those families do end up in temporary accommodation for very extended periods of time, particularly larger families whom local authorities find particularly difficult to find suitable accommodation for. Moving on to the next slide. We also heard a lot in our lived experience focus groups about just how difficult life was for people who were coming through the asylum system and then going into the homelessness system immediately after. And a lot of these challenges were around the short period between being granted refugee status and having to leave home office accommodation. Now, this has been extended recently from 28 to 56 days, but that's still a relatively short period, particularly for people who will, in most cases, not be able to have generated any financial assets. Mostly they're not allowed to work while they're seeking asylum. And so for most, this kind of lack of money combined with being ejected at short notice means that it precipitates a homelessness crisis, which is very difficult for the people involved and is causing local authorities a great deal of stress as well. Running through the testimony of those with the experience of the asylum system was a sense of being negatively judged, distrusted, and rendered powerless by the attitude of a range of statutory and voluntary bodies. And there was a very strong sense from refugee interviewees in particular that they were worried about complaining about anything or sort of rocking the boat because they felt in such a vulnerable position. And that came across not just with respect to defending their tenancy rights with private landlords and so on, but also in dealing with local authorities and other public bodies too. Moving on to the next slide. While the statutory homelessness system and the asylum system are absolutely core in shaping the homelessness experiences among minoritised communities in the UK, and we have the most comprehensive evidence on them, we also had the opportunity to explore qualitatively the role of other public and voluntary sector bodies in mitigating or exacerbating homelessness risks. I just want to give you a bit of a flavour of what came out of some of those aspects of the research as well. And I think taking health services, for example, a lot of the discussion focused around mental health services, and it is already well evidenced that Black people in particular often fare badly in the mental health system. They're more likely to be sectioned, they're less likely to receive supportive intervention for a range of reasons, but including that it seems to be the case that they come into contact with these services later in their mental health journey when things are already at a more critical stage, potentially jeopardising their housing. And this frontline worker in that first quote captures this sort of dynamic where people don't have contact with services until it's at a crisis stage and things can spiral out of control, putting their housing at risk. And we heard quite a lot about how Black men single Black men with mental health issues were particularly affected. Another system which is very important, but particularly for women, is the criminal justice system, which we heard repeatedly was letting down survivors of domestic abuse, not dealing with perpetrators appropriately, instead assuming that the woman would have to leave their home, generating homelessness for her and her children, rather than actually dealing with the perpetrators so that the women can actually remain with their children in the family home and avoid homelessness. So that was a particularly big issue for South Asian women, certainly in the West Midlands, where this is a disproportionate driver of homelessness. But there were also some positive examples of good practice that we heard in the West Midlands and elsewhere. And I've included a quote here from a focus group of people with lived experience who talked about the huge support that they'd received from the local school. And this included support with helping them access housing, benefits, support for the children, and just generally providing whole family support via these family coordinators. So there was I suppose a generally fairly bleak picture, but there were definitely some examples of good practice as well. So moving on to the final slide, I just want to give you, again, a flavour of some of the evolving recommendations that we're developing at the moment based on this pretty substantial programme of work that we've conducted over the last 3 years. We are there is no avoiding the huge kind of material structural pressures on the homelessness system as a whole, which affect all ethnicities, but particularly affect minoritized communities because of their disproportionate exposure to homelessness. So that involves addressing the undersupply of social housing, increasing and sustaining an increased local housing allowance rate so people can access the private rented sector, and also putting local authority finances on a more sustainable footing. But we've also got a series of recommendations which are more specific to minoritized communities, which include ensuring that the forthcoming cross-government homelessness strategy embeds understanding and action at national level on impact of homelessness on minoritized communities, on re-engineering the link between the asylum and the statutory homelessness system, so it's not such a predictable and yet avoidable driver of large-scale homelessness. We've got a number of ideas about tackling racism among private landlords, and also prioritising upstream prevention in minoritised communities, including good practice examples we came across in the West Midlands about using the whole range of council data that's available to target support with financial and other forms of support on vulnerable communities. We think there's a lot of scope for focusing on key local partnerships, like with mental health services, criminal justice services, to try and prevent homelessness. And one of the strongest themes in the study as a whole, particularly from professional interviewees, was the importance of rejecting ethnicity-blind approaches and promoting robust ethnic monitoring to call out and tackle racist assumptions which are leading to adverse outcomes and inequalities for minoritized groups. And I will leave it there, Sarah, and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. That's a whole load of fascinating insight and interesting things to take forward. But we're going to have reflections now from three contributors who are going to come and both talk about what they're doing in their work, but also give their reflections on Suzanne's findings. I'm going to give you the introductions for all three of them, then we'll move seamlessly between one and the other as they talk. So Dr. Nick Clare is an Associate Professor in Geography at the University of Nottingham and a British Academy Innovation Fellow. His research explores the relationships between housing, homelessness, race and class. And with colleagues, he's currently exploring the rise in out-of-area housing placements. Nick's work also looks at the links between housing disadvantage and forms of exploitation, with a particular focus on how tenants and service users seek to improve their conditions and experiences. And while he focuses predominantly on the East Midlands, as a geographer, Nick's always keen to put these findings in a wider comparative context. Then we'll hear from Dr. Shabna Begum, who joined the Runnymede Trust in 2021 as a senior researcher and became director of research before taking on the interim CEO and the permanent CEO role in 2024. In 2018, Shabna started a PhD at Queen Mary University, London, considering her own family's experience of migration and racism in the 1970s East London as an entry point into a wider community history around a Bengal squatters movement, and she completed that doctoral research in 2021. Her work has been at the heart of all the Runnymede Trust's recent projects, including research on education, including art education, police in schools, and more broadly around the cost of living crisis, the experience of women in colour in the workplace, and racism in migration debates. And finally, although not really finally, Jean Templeton. Jean has been the Chief Executive of St Basil since 2000. Prior to that, had over 20 years' experience of managing housing and neighbourhood services in a number of local authorities in the North East and Midlands. She's chair of the West Midlands Combined Authorities Homelessness Task Force, chair of the West Midlands Homelessness and Health Network, and a member of the government's Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Expert Group. She was chair of the National Youth Homelessness Parliament from 2013 to 2022, and is a member of the Birmingham Housing Partnership Board and Birmingham Social Housing Partnership Executive. So I'm sure you agree, three really excellent speakers. So I'll pass over to Nick first for your reflections and thoughts.
Cheers. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, so I wanted to briefly talk today about the increase in what we call out-of-area housing placements. So yeah, Jill, if you could just pop to the next slide, thanks. Yeah, so this is from the Housing Act 1996, and this is section 208, which is talking about when a local authority can't house people in its own area. You see the point 1 says they should, where possible, in their local district. But if you go click next slide, you'll see there's a couple of caveats saying if they can't and they have to house people outside of that area, they need to give notice to that new local authority, and that must be done within 14 days. So some colleagues and I at University of Nottingham, we decided to investigate this. So we sent freedom of information requests to every single local authority in the country to find out how many people they were sending and where they were sending those people. And it built up a very interesting, but I would admit slightly depressing picture. And the reason I wanted to speak about this today is because it gives a really interesting insight into some of these systems that Suzanne's been speaking about. And in particular, this idea that we know a lot of the national pressures that are facing housing providers, local authorities, which is often financial. But those national pressures always have their own kind of local version, their local iteration of that. And to deal with those local challenges, what you're increasingly finding is that local authorities are trying to kind of move these challenges around. Sometimes that's sectoral. So what we mean by that is it's people in housing trying to move issues into social care or somewhere else because it gets them off one part of the council's books onto another. But I really want to talk about the spatial out of area, which is what we're going to look at today. So the next bit here, we plotted all this data and we had some pretty kind of shocking findings. So the first of these is that 91% of all local authorities are placing households out of area, so in a different part of the country. 18% of those are housing people over 100 miles away and 6% over 200 miles away from where those families were initially. And in London, there are real issues here. We found that 50% of all London local authorities actually held housing stock in other local authorities. So it's clearly a systemic issue. It's not just that the kind of occasional families being put to a different part of the country. It's almost baked into this system that's happening here. When we collated all the figures, we found that over 34,000 households have been placed out of area, and that was almost 3 times the official rate that we had been told. So the scale of this issue is huge, and it's being significantly underreported. But one of the biggest problems was there was a huge lack of communication between these local authorities. Many of the receiving local authorities had no idea that families were being sent to them, and that was obviously having really dangerous impacts for those individuals. But the reason I think this is particularly relevant for this conversation today was, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, given all that Suzanne said, minoritized households were being hugely overrepresented, in this data. So if you take London, 58% of all the households who were sent out of area were classed as BME, minoritized groups, compared to 46% of the census in London. So again, you can see a significant overrepresentation there. This was also the case with migrant households, especially likely to be sent. And what we found was as well, many of these families and households were being sent to often very white areas that was putting them at significant levels of risk. But another thing that was also quite shocking was the number of local authorities were just not recording any data around ethnicity. And again, Suzanne said, we need these robust data sets to be able to kind of implement things. So it was this particular finding around race that we thought was relevant. So we've worked now trying to map this to try and put a kind of visual picture to what's going on. So this was a map pulled together by a colleague who some of you may know called Nigel de Nerona, which shows the pattern taking place in London. And you can see then basically people are being sent all over the place. The thicker the line, the darker the colour of the line means more people are being sent. But you will see that this is taking place all over London with people being moved around. There's a couple of things that we've picked out which we think are especially worth flagging. So on the next slide, you start to see a situation of basically families being moved around parts of the country. So this is taking place in London. We found from Croydon, 141 households being sent to Lambeth, where 144 families from Lambeth were being sent to Lewisham, where they were sending 148 families back to Croydon. So you're seeing you've effectively got people being cycled round cities. But there's another element of the feedback loop. Lambeth itself, if we click onto the next thing, was sending about 308 families back to Croydon. So we're just seeing this circulation of families around London. And on the next slide, we also then see we've got similar things between Barnet and Brent, who are almost swapping similar levels of families. But it's not taking place just in London. We also saw this in the West Midlands, which is on the next slide as well, which has Birmingham and Sandwell are basically sending similar numbers of families to each other. And again, we think when it's placed like this, it shows how much the system is failing, because in many ways, Often these local authorities do not know that they're receiving these families, and they're sending things blind to each other. And one of the impacts then is that different local authorities are trying to deal with their own problems in a very isolated sense, and that's spreading like an almost kind of contagious effect over to other local authorities. So on the final slide then, we're just talking through some of the kind of issues that have come from this. Well, obviously, people are losing their social networks and their spatial networks. They're being moved a long way away from family, from friends, from support networks. This can then start to embed further levels of structural discrimination. And some of the research we've done has shown how this links to race, also to class, and also to gender, and how those things therefore intersect with each other. Suzanne mentioned the impact on mental health, and this is something that came through really strongly with the interviews that we did with households who've been moved out of area. It was having kind of really severe impacts on their mental health. For some people, it also meant they were losing their ability to get to work, and that can then drive further forms of exploitation, and in some cases even become vulnerable to forced labour. And we found that people had real difficulty then accessing new services or schools or dentists or anything that they needed. And this was especially problematic again for minoritized households who had often struggled to find some of the kind of appropriate services in the place they've been living before, now moved 100, 200 miles away, they've got to start completely again. As the next point says, this is also an incredibly costly approach. This lack of communication between local authorities is effectively outsourcing a problem from one local authority to another, but then can massively increase those costs for those people in a different area because they're effectively having to start again. And again, this goes back to basically the challenges that each local authority is having as the increased costs of temporary accommodation is kind of absolutely spiraling out of control. So what we're starting to see then is effectively this outsourcing might be cheaper in the short term, might be cheaper for individual local authorities, but at the aggregate level, for the national picture, it's much more expensive, and it means the care and the support that's been provided is much less good. However, our final point, though, is that the solutions are not always costly. The main one is just better coordination between these local authorities, at the very least, adhering to that kind of statutory duty I flagged at the start of letting the other local authority know within 14 days. So the reason I wanted to flag this today was just I think it's a topic that's becoming more prevalent. I think the kind of exchange, the swapping of families, the rotating of families around gets across the fact that it's just quite an incoherent approach. But it shows then that the systems that we're kind of dealing with are kind of close to breaking point, and we know that disproportionately this will affect minoritized families. My email's there. I'd love to hear from anybody who's experienced this or has any interest in this, especially if they work for local authorities or in other housing areas. But yeah, very, very happy to kind of expand on this through any questions. I'll hand over to Shabna now, who I know has spoken about some of these examples with families being moved to the northeast from London.
Thank you so much for that, Nick, and thank you to Suzanne and the team for all of the work that you've done on this project. And yeah, as we said at the beginning, Runnymede Trust have been involved with a particular part of the work that was published last year, which was looking at kind of experiences of homelessness, but in particular how kind of Black and minoritized communities understand those experiences and kind of the definitions around that. And so we were really grateful to have been part of the work with that particular piece of work. I guess both Suzanne and Nick have kind of talked in quite granular detail around some of the kind of key findings, both of the original project and obviously Nick's work more directly here. And I will definitely touch on some of those themes. I wanted to take some time, first of all, perhaps to just zoom out a little bit and kind of talk about a little bit about where Runnymede Trust sits on this. So the Runnymede Trust is a think tank. We are work is focused on racial justice, and we cover kind of everything from whether it's policing, education, migration, and so on. So we kind of our research focuses on a number of different kind of areas. What I was really pleased to see about this particular report and the work that has Suzanne is talking about today is the links are made around how the different systems interact to create these unequal and discriminatory kind of outcomes. I think that the work that Suzanne's done has highlighted the impact of austerity and how that has kind of created some incredibly challenging conditions for local authorities as well as national government level kind of policy frameworks that have come out of that. I think that the work obviously encourages across government strategy, which is something that I think that the new Labour government coming in last year promised this mission-driven approach, has been talking about kind of developing across government strategy. One of the things that we as the Runnymede Trust are looking forward to is the development of a commitment to the Race Equality Act, which was an idea which would bring together some of the kind of different ways in which these systems that we have all touched on and have been touched on through the presentations need to have a much more coherent and integrated approach. I was also very grateful for the work that's been done around asylum accommodation. It's become one of the areas where we, the Runnymede Trust, have been trying to put more of our research and policy influencing efforts. I think that traditionally the migration and racial justice sector have kind of operated as two separate spheres, and I think it's increasingly obvious how kind of the work around migrant rights and asylum justice are absolutely integrated and kind of connected to racial justice issues. And I guess that on that note, I wanted to kind of go back to this to last year and to link to the racist riots, actually, because I think that when we're talking about systems, we also have to understand the bigger kind of narratives, the understandings, the kind of the stories that we tell about housing and homelessness and who belongs and who is entitled to housing, which fundamentally underpins some of the outcomes that have been described in the findings shared thus far. And I think that if we think back to the racist riots of last year, then and the targeting in particular of hotels providing accommodation for people seeking asylum, that kind of the attack on kind of the Rotherham Hotel, for example, those are linked fundamentally to kind of ideas and narratives that we kind of have promoted around housing, home, belonging. And there is a policy environment and a policy story where we have created this idea that what is essentially kind of de facto detention for people seeking asylum in these kind of hotels has been kind of converted into a story which is around this idea of luxury accommodation being kind of given to people seeking asylum. And I think that that has been a really problematic part of the conversation around both people seeking asylum in this country, but around housing and belonging and the distribution of housing and where the responsibility and where the blame lies, and that kind of displacement of blame onto people seeking asylum, which is highlighted in this report in terms of also some of the kind of real lived experience of people who are at the sharpest end of being housed in those hotels, and then on where they're granted asylum, the kind of the time span between being given asylum and then kind of being outsourced out into a housing system that simply isn't resourced to accommodate them. And I think that those racist riots, the fact that the hotels were targeted, tells us how important these kind of narratives around housing and belonging are to how we understand the distribution of housing, but also who is deserving and what kind of treatment they're deserving of. And it speaks back to Suzanne's wider point about why these things, which we know have been evidenced over a long period of time, have not been reacted to, why they are not prioritized and why they are not then kind of seen as a policy priority. So I guess I wanted to kind of start with that point in terms of kind of making that point that where we're talking about the policy environment and the policy conditions, there is a fundamental problem with the narratives that we currently have around that, and they are deeply racialized. Moving on, I wanted to just quickly share something around a recent report that we've done with the Health Foundation, which looks at how racism affects health. And in that report, we were again taking an approach similar to the kind of priorities from this particular piece of work, which is looking at the systems which create a worse environment for people of colour to be able to experience good health. So really looking at the wider determinants of health and arguing that there are that racism should be considered a determinant of health. We looked at systems, both the labour market and the housing system in that report, to try and highlight how the experience of people of colour, not as a kind of homogenous group, because as Suzanne's research has highlighted, there are kind of different experiences, with some groups experiencing the worst kind of excesses and others being more or less protected from them. But in our report, we wanted to highlight how, for example, the labour market impacts on health outcomes for certain groups of colour. So we know that people of colour are more likely to be in the lowest paid insecure jobs, and that the kind of poverty related outcomes to that have both a direct physical health impact, but they also have a mental health impact as well. And one of the things that we highlighted in that report was around the concept of weathering, and how the stress of navigating discrimination in the labour market, whether that is in initial recruitment, whether that's through progression, whether it's through the kind of unfair practices within your employment environment that you experience, has an impact on your kind of stress levels, and that has an impact on your physical health. And I think that that's interesting because it relates to some of the things that both Nick and Suzanne raised in terms of navigating complex housing systems which are not built to actually address your needs, and you are constantly diverted or kind of subverted in your efforts to advocate for yourself. So in that report, we looked at the labour market and talked about how the fact that people of colour are less likely to have good quality and secure employment does impact on their wealth outcomes. So wealth outcomes obviously relate to your housing options and your housing opportunities. So we went on to go and look at how, in particular, the housing system operates to impact on health experiences of certain groups of colour. And obviously, again, it's been highlighted in the research that was shared that where people have access to home ownership, that affords you a greater deal of protection, both in terms of your income and outgoings, but your security over your tenure. And that isn't afforded to you if you are subject to private rental market, and particularly for people of colour in London, the kind of the very high rates of kind of that cost. And also, as Suzanne's research highlighted, not just the actual costs and rental outgoings, but also the costs of racism, the cost of private landlords kind of discriminating against you within that private rental market, all has an impact on health. We know that the government has obviously talked something around the ethnicity pay gap reporting as one of the measures to try and address labour market inequalities in particular. And we wait to see what there is a consultation that's open currently, and we wait to see what that kind of leads to. But we know that actually we're also living in a climate where all of these measures are also subject to quite considerable attack and derision at the minute as well. In terms of housing, again, I don't need to kind of go over some of the points that have been outlined here, but for us, we talked about the access to housing in terms of being much more likely to live in obviously poor quality, overcrowded homes, more likely to experience homelessness, less likely to have access to green space or a garden space. All of these things have an impact on health outcomes. And we often cite the example of Awab Ishaq, the toddler who died as a result of exposure to black mold in his house, and the family's inability to advocate when they knew there was something wrong, and the fact that the housing association decided that actually they would rather blame the family and kind of explain it as a cultural deficit, that the family themselves didn't know how to bathe properly in the home that caused the mold. I guess from our perspective, just to kind of bring it to a conclusion, there is the systemic issues that have been identified in Suzanne's work, but also in Nick's work, are in no way new. But they kind of reiterate both the kind of how embedded these problems are, but also how in many circumstances these outcomes are getting worse. And so I think that we are looking forward to working with the government, but also working with our academic partners to think about how we use the findings of this research to shift both the broader policy narrative and then the actual policy details in order to get to a better place as well. I will leave it at that, and I will hand over to Jean.
Thank you, Shabna, and also Nick and Suzanne. I kind of coming at it from not an academic perspective and slightly different perspective. And Jill, if I could share just a few slides about the approach we're taking in the West Midlands, and how sort of pleased we were really to be able to work with Suzanne and have the deep dive into the West Midlands. So my day job works with young people that are homeless, and so we deal with the presenting issues, as many of us do that work in this sector, all of the time, the presenting issues and the systemic issues, to really be able to have the evidence, to be able to focus on the systemic drivers of all of those presenting issues is absolutely invaluable, which is why I am so pleased and excited about where we can go with this work. Back in 2017, when there were mayoral elections, and a lot of the mayors at that time that were elected the first time round, obviously not London, but the others, there was a lot of focus on homelessness. And at that time, the government then particularly saw homelessness through the lens of rough sleeping. And there was rough sleeping strategies, and there was focus on, and the demographics of those that are sleeping rough are very different from the demographics of those that go through the homelessness system, of young people, of those families in temporary accommodation. And so you get this particular perspective. And as Shabna had said, the narrative changes to be the narrative of lifestyle choices and their responsibilities and things. So it's easy to kind of place the responsibility elsewhere. The mayor in the West Midlands at the time, and Greater Manchester and others, looked at, we need to do something about homelessness. And our West Midlands mayor decided that he would like to set up a task force. And it was when we were discussing about this task force, well, what do you want it to do? Do you want it to focus on homelessness, or do you want to focus on rough sleeping? And he was very open about that and took the advice that actually we need to focus on homelessness in its widest sense, and not just rough sleeping. So I was fortunate. I was appointed as the independent chair, and we've got cross-sector, cross-region, all public services, leads for homelessness, voluntary community sector, business sector, and other public sectors, as well as the housing association sector. And we set our objective as actually looking at the systemic issues, because mayoral responsibility, they don't have statutory responsibility for homelessness. They don't, mainly now, there might be more in the future, technically have resources for tackling homelessness, but they do have convening power, they do have collaboration, they do have that ability to look at how we can make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And so our objective, we decided that our objective would be to design out homelessness in the West Midlands. How do we actually have a mainstream system that is much more inclusive and that deals with the systemic change? And this probably looks overwhelming, this slide for many people there, but for us in the West Midlands, it's kind of, we call it the plan on the page, really. And it was very much about looking at whole life course, children, families, young people, older single people, right across the piece in terms of what their experience was and what was there within our systems. What universal prevention is there? What is there in the mainstream systems that can keep people in? How do we know if those people are going to fall out? And how do we get support and assistance to them to help them stay in the mainstream? If people are in crisis, how do we get there very, very quickly and make that very, very short-lived so that they can move on and they can have the support they need and settled home? And it's not linear, but in terms of, it's just the way we've presented it there. But specifically, what are the lessons that we can learn? What are the gaps in our mainstream systems that enable people to fall out? And how do we have that systemic change? And we were looking particularly around the combined authority mainstream strategies in terms of the bottom. The amber box is really where we spent 18 months mapping, gapping, really looking at what is there in those different boxes of prevention and where are the gaps. And the gaps will be no surprise to most of you, and certainly reflects some of the discussion we've already had. Housing supply. There's no national housing strategy. We have homelessness strategies. We default to homelessness, but we don't have, national housing strategies. Welfare-related poverty, absolutely. Trapping people and the links with the housing system, local housing allowances, Suzanne talked about, and all of those issues, absolutely critical. Good employment in terms of how do we ensure that people are able to be in employment. Often when you're in temporary accommodation or you're in exempt supported accommodation, it is so hard. You generate debt, you fall out of your accommodation and you lose your job as well. And then you'd think information, advice and guidance was actually something that would be accessible. It is if you're at crisis point, but we've defaulted back to crisis. That non-stigmatized, generally accessible, community-based information, advice and guidance, lots of it has disappeared. And if you look at some of the generic services like Citizens Advice Bureau, they'll tell you that they can maybe take 10 to 20% of calls that come through to them. So people are increasingly pushed more and more into crisis. And then, the siloed systems that we have, the lack of integration, the competition for resources. Nick talked about the passing around of people. So it's not my problem, it's someone else's. So transition to adulthood almost becomes like it's a transition between services. Oh, children's services gone. Here we go to adult social care. It's your responsibility now, as opposed to an actual transition in terms of your through your life course. So lots and lots of issues, and disproportionately minoritized communities, global majority communities, people of colour are, as we've heard, in those parts that fall out. Thanks. Next slide, please, Jill. So we were trying to in order to look at the systemic issues, and nobody will disagree with you about tackling systemic issues. Nobody will say, oh, that's not the issue. But the hard-baked defence mechanisms in every part of the system, and I include everybody, I mean all of us, the hard-baked defence mechanisms often make us defend our intentions rather than really understanding the experience and the impact. And particularly when we're under pressure, resource-wise or whatever, we default back into defending those intentions and those part of the systems, rather than actually looking at what might we do differently? How might collaboration be better than competition? How might we look at the overall resource that we all have and see what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve for people? So we were trying to kind of redefine homelessness, if you like, as the ultimate exclusion, as an equalities issue, because if it was seen in that way, rather than it was seen particularly, oh, it's you folks in homelessness, it's your job to deal with that, it's a housing issue. No, actually, it's fundamentally an equalities issue. And we can see by the evidence of who's falling out of the system why that is the case. And whilst there are interrelated factors, the structural and systemic factors as well as individual factors, but we need to look at them together. And absolutely, it is not true that we're all no more than a paycheck away from homelessness. So next slide, please. So by intentionally trying to redefine homelessness in this way, We were then also trying to get every part, and bear in mind, we were looking at it from a combined authority. So absolutely looking at every part to say, okay, how do you design in inclusion into each of all of these different elements of your system? How, you know, capital I, capital N, how do you keep people in the system? How do we look at the kind of universal domain that works for some of us, and that, you know, we all occupy, but it does only work for some of us? How do we make that more inclusive for all? So we were looking at, you know, the kind of principle that we need to have that shared regional approach, that cuts across all sectors and disciplines. And it looks at the humanizing element of how actually those systems respond to people's needs and how they interrelate with each other. And as I say, 7 years now, we're going into 8. We really wanted to reinforce the evidence all the time about who is falling out. And so the work that Suzanne's doing, and the extent of the report is fantastic. It's huge. It's we're really, really proud and pleased that the combined authority has been prepared to take this and expose everything that's happening, because unless we can expose what the real issues are, unless we can look at the actual evidence, unless we can consider what those recommendations are for all parts of the system, then I think all we're doing is we're giving it good chat, we're giving it good talk, we're giving it good, yeah, we agree with all the principles, but are we really making the changes that we need to make? Are we really making the systemic changes? And that is, you know, as Suzanne said, it's national level, you know, it's regional level, it's cross-systemic level, it's in everything. That the kind of the understanding of whiteness as a system, which we're all part of, is really, really interesting. Some of the kind of the most useful sort of learning that I've ever had was about understanding that, about whiteness as a system that we actually all perpetuate in some ways, but it disproportionately impacts on others. So this is where we're at. And what do we mean by inclusion? Next slide, please, Jill. I mean, it's again, I've put it deliberately into the silos here. And this is just, you know, this is not everything. But when we have the debates and discussions, then often it comes back to, what do you want us to do as a homelessness task force? What do you think we should do? And kind of what we're saying is, we want you to think about that in your part of the system. What does inclusion look like? How do you keep people in? How do you stop young people, for example, and children falling out of the education system? 70% of the young people, we have some 4,000 young people a year coming to us at St Basil's, and 70% of those are from minoritized communities. That's huge. Also, 42% in our services are care experienced, and 75% in our schemes for serially excluded young people are care experienced. And disproportionately, you look at the care system and who's in the care system, and you look at the criminal justice system and who's that. So it's all this cross-cutting stuff. So how do we actually ensure that we deal with those at the different levels? Employment, you know, many of us are employers as well as being employed, etc. How do we look at that and look at how we ensure there are both pathways in and people don't get excluded? We've had proof of concept schemes in the West Midlands looking at how do we have a rent simplification scheme that enables young people who need the support in supported housing to simplify their working opportunities, so that they're not having to triple navigate 2 benefit systems and work, end up in debt, and probably lose their home and their job. Oh my goodness, the defense mechanisms in the systems that are actually trying to make that proof of concept work. And it's not, you know, not bad people, not people that are saying, you know, we don't want this to work, but the systemic complexities and the defense mechanisms of the existing systems, unbelievable. Inclusion welfare, you know, the whole sort of thing about instead of it has the opposite impact for so many people. And all the work again that Suzanne, our sphere, have done around destitution levels. We've still got universal credit living allowances for young people that are below destitution level. No one, who can exist on that? And then again, when you look at who's falling in, so all those direct and indirect drivers that has been identified in the research are so important. And so it goes on. Inclusion housing. As I say, we don't have a national housing strategy. We've got a homelessness strategy. And even that is sort of almost, it's kind of, I'd really hope, and I'm on the so-called expert group, and I really hope there is listening about how we do this very differently. But let's see. And so we go on. We talked about, you know, all of the examples of health and social care and mental health particularly, and who that impacts on. And then the wider issues around community, instead of moving people all over the place and away from the community relationship that Nick talked about. How do we do that differently? So I'm going to stop there, because I am really pleased that we will have the evidence from all of this work to say, no, we can't be in denial anymore. Stop just defending intentions. Let's look at what the actual experiences and impacts are. Let's rise above our own defense elements of our own systems, and let's really look at, you know, as you say, it's not always about more money. Sometimes it is genuinely about, what is it we're all trying to achieve? How do we humanize? How do we simplify? How do we pull together the resources we have and actually make our systems work for everyone? Inclusive, capital I, capital N. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was great, and thanks for all those presenters there. Just a great example of bringing it all together and using our insights to make the rallying call for change. We are typically running really short of time for questions. However, I'm going to try and squeeze a couple in. What I'd like to bring is from Tracy Bignell at the Race Equality Foundation. Tracy was part of our webinar series. We've delivered them in partnership with ICER and the Race Equality Foundation. Unfortunately, she's not been able to remain on this call. She's had other engagements to attend to, but she has got a question which she'd like me to put, and which is this. Given the racism and impact of stereotypical assumptions on people's experience and response to being homeless, what can be done to empower individuals' self-advocacy across the systems to help address this? I'm going to probably go to you, Shabna. I think you touched on this within your response to Suzanne's report. I don't know whether you want to give a reply on that one.
I can start. I guess I would push gently and respectfully back on the question, because I think that where we focus on individual advocacy, we kind of relinquish the responsibility on systems and institutions. And I think there is obviously work to do around making sure that people feel confident enough to be able to advocate for themselves, and they have the understanding of how systems work. But what we've established through, I think, the conversation here is that there is a culture of slipperiness, of diversion, of kind of not accepting responsibility. It's virtually impossible for people who are kind of even well equipped and well resourced and have social capital and knowledge and understanding of these systems to navigate them. They're designed to be complex and kind of obfuscate and not kind of help the people who are in need. So I think that we have a tendency to focus on individuals' lifestyle, cultural deficit explanations, and I would like us to see from the work that's been described here that actually it's the systems that need kind of to be addressed, and it's the problems that are embedded in these systems that need us to take some kind of responsibility. So yeah, I would probably push back a little bit and say we can do that, but actually it's those broader systems that need correcting.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to answer that, or should I just have sneak another quick question in, perhaps? So the other question I think we could look at is, do you have any suggestions of how we can frame these findings to effect change at a local level, given the shift in the local government politics? And we're all aware that there was quite a change in some areas with the local elections last week, and that might have an impact on what we're talking about. I don't know whether anyone has any reflections on that, about how change can be brought about that way. Who shall I go to? Who's looking most enthusiastic? Jean, you touched on some of this in your response as well. Do you have any suggestions of how we can frame them to make the most impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's this is the evidence there is unchallengeable. Okay, so often it's kind of anecdotal, or it's this bit or whatever, and people can park it somewhere, can't they? This evidence needs to be out there and needs to be, you know, it's not as easy to challenge something as robust as this. And also the others, you know, not, you know, obviously there's lots of others there. And I think we need to avoid it being parked in academic spaces. That's the thing for me. We need to make sure that it is actually brought into the system. I think the other thing is, if it's seen as just only about challenging those that are already under immense pressure resource-wise, and I'm thinking about our local authorities, if it's just seen as that, then you will get defence. And so I think, you know, that there is the recognition of all of the challenges and the resource issues as well is really important. Otherwise, people will just go into their silos again and we'll just get defence. So I think we've got to be radically creative. We've got to be courageous. We've got to actually say, we've all got an issue here. We're all part of this system, okay? Whatever bit of it we're in, we're all part of it. So let's actually look how we can collaborate to tackle these issues and find different ways of dealing with them, so that we don't just default back to defence mechanisms, which then become blame, which then, and as you say, the politics of what is changing in terms of some of our county councils, you know, some of our local areas, then absolutely we need to have a different, more radically creative approach to that. Otherwise, we're just going to end up in boom, boom, you know, and who loses out? Well, we know that, don't we?
Yes, absolutely.
Sarah, if I could just jump in on that
please.
as well. I mean, one of the things that came across, just to back up what Jean's saying, really, I mean, as academics, of course, we always hope that the evidence is powerful, but it has to be accompanied by the sort of narrative and framing that Shabna and Jean were talking about as well. You need that combination of the evidence to back it up, but also people who are influential, who are change makers, actually sort of framing that in a way that helps win these arguments, which are getting tougher all the time. We saw that with the politics of what happened last week. But I think what was striking for me is the extent to which professionals that we interviewed really foregrounded the importance of robust data, robust ethnic monitoring, because of the relatively subtle and nuanced nature of some of the decision making that was reinforcing these embedded systemic disadvantages, that you had to actually have really explicit, unarguable evidence, as Jean has said, of ethnic disparities that just couldn't be defended, and actually having that data at a local level starts to explain things like, for example, well, why are particular people not being referred for mental health support and others are, and so on. That can be on a case-by-case basis quite difficult to kind of argue, but when you actually look at the cumulative impacts and you've got robust evidence on that, then you really force a conversation and hopefully force change. So I think it's not, evidence isn't the whole story. It's certainly not on its own, won't do it for you, but it's a sort of indispensable part of those narratives that we're all going to have to get smarter about pushing in the very, very difficult political climate we all find ourselves in now.
It feels like your report, the timing of your report and Nick's work, I guess, together feels really key, feels a really important time for that to be shared. There are some technical questions around data on Roma and travellers, which I think we'll pick up outside of this event. That's okay, and we'll get the response from Suzanne and make sure, Nancy, that you get a response to those questions in detail. But I want to just quickly pass on to Georgia from Crisis, who's just going to talk about sort of the next steps in this whole process. Thank you, Georgia.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. We wanted to shift the focus away from the presenters and actually move towards the audience and all of the people attending today, to really start thinking about what can be done to take this forward more on an individual level, I suppose. We're a really wide and varied group in this webinar, the presenters and also the attendees. So we'd like to prompt you all to have a think about what you in your unique position at work or in other areas could do to sort of drive what we've been covering in this webinar and in others forward. In the immediate, what could be done straight away, what could be done long term, what's small change that can be done or large. And what we hope to do is sort of collate all this together and share it around to use as inspiration and sharing ideas. So we've done this through Slido. There's an event code which is hashtag taking this forward. With that QR code, which also I believe is now in the chat as well, you'd be able to join the conversation. Your response would be anonymous, and we're not sharing responses live. We'll just be collating them all so that we can share them all after the event. And we're going to leave this open as well, so that any other thoughts that come in of the takeaways that you have of what's been discussed today, and also potential opportunities that others might want to think about as well, can be explored. That should still be in the chat, so you'll be able to review that and add your contributions. So I think we can probably move on to the final slide, which is a wrap up from me, really. So I work at Crisis as a senior research and evaluation officer, and this is the third and final webinar on racism and homelessness that we've been putting together. My colleagues at Crisis and I have been working closely with the team at iSphere and Race Equality Foundation to set up these webinars following Crisis's own research into racism and homelessness in October last year. We at Crisis, not being the experts in this space, wanted to bring together people with research practice and lived experience to share and discuss and reflect collectively. So the first webinar, which was co-produced and co-presented by two of the community researchers for Crisis's research, focused on the human experience of racism and homelessness, and the second shifted the focus to services and practices and explored the way that the role they play in racialized housing system and proactive steps that are and could be taken to redress the balance for service users. Just because the webinars are finishing doesn't mean that we should let this fall off the agenda. There are reasons to be optimistic. The Westminster government have committed to a cross-government strategy for ending homelessness, which is an amazing opportunity. And while this will be a strategy for England, some of the policies being called for will have an impact across all nations. So to make sure that the learning from all the rich research we've heard about is brought into the decisions about the way forward, Crisis are working closely with government on the strategy and with parliamentarians to influence the strategy. And we're continually emphasising the need for an equalities lens in this strategy so that people who are overrepresented and more likely to experience homelessness are sort of central to the outcome. However, there's still much more that can be done through and within services across the sector, and there's much more to learn and implement. So the sign-ups to these webinars, we feel, are a real testament to people across the UK wanting change, and until we reach that point where housing is equally accessible and better quality for all, regardless of ethnicity. So with this in mind, we'd like to invite you to continue to be involved in this ongoing work and to make your voice heard in bringing about change. So we will be inviting attendees to sign up to be contacted again about upcoming publications and updates from us about this area of work. So I will be emailing all the registered attendees with a link to the recording, which will be on YouTube channel. That channel is also where the recordings of the two other webinars are saved, along with documents and resources that our speakers and panel have talked about today. In this follow-up email, we'll also share Race Equality Foundation's work in this space, the inspirations that have come through on the Slido, and you'll be invited to give permission for us as a partnership to remain in contact with you. So finally, a great many thanks to all those who have attended the webinars, to the co-presenters and panelists in this webinar and the previous two, and to our partners at iSphere and Race Equality Foundation pulling these webinars together with us.
Thank you. And so we're done. Your lunch is calling you, I'm sure. Just to add my thanks really to Georgia to say thank you for coming along. Thank you for staying engaged. Thank you for the really positive comments we've had in the chat as well. That's really encouraging for us. And especially big thank you to Suzanne for presenting such a brilliant report, and to Jean and Shabna and Nick for your contributions, which were excellent and real food for thought as we take this work forward. Please stay in touch. Please respond to the email asking for that. We'd love to hear from you and just take this word forward until we see some real change happening. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.